Thank you. Thank you so much, Rashmi. Uh, Thank you, Subbu, for introducing us. Thank you, Rajesh and WMG for giving me and Rajiv the chance to come and speak to you, everybody. And thanks, obviously, to Karthik, who introduced me to Rajesh. I don't know where Karthik is right now. There he is. And thank you to all the guests who have taken out your precious time and gone through Bangalore traffic and come here. So the topic today, you know, within Reasonomics, I'm going to speak about how India is now taking off. It's kind of a cliche, and there is always an inflection point. There is always a takeoff. But I think this time the wolf is for real. India is actually taking off, and I'll try to convince you by the end of this talk, with reason, why that is the case. So I'll first quickly go through the first two slides to let you know the structure of my speech, and then go back from the first slide, hopefully over the next half hour. So the first thing I'm saying is that conservatively, Indian GDP will be $12 trillion or more in 2030. So just to give you an idea, HSBC came out with a report recently predicting 5.9 trillion. Some people in the government have said 6 or 8 trillion. Mukesh Ambani said 10 trillion. And I'm saying $12 trillion conservatively. So I can sound like one of those guys who writes Dow 100,000 books and then runs away when there is a bear market. So I can appreciate any skepticism you have. I'll come to it in a moment. And this is basically the structure of the rest of the speech. Basically, the two key points you need to take away is there were a lot of headwinds for the Indian growth story, which are now becoming tailwinds. There are a lot of issues which were on the margin slowing us, which are now going to accelerate our growth. That's the key takeaway of the speech. Those 3 points are governance. In the last 4 years, that's been Narendra Modi's government. Demographics and technology, and I think Subbu kind of hinted at those points briefly. Within governance, I'll be covering infrastructure investment, lower inflation, then lower interest rates, some key structural reforms that happened, the formalizing and the financializing of the economy, and finally, something less appreciated about state capacity. So let's go back to the first slide. How many people know Raj Krishna coined the term the Hindu rate of growth in the 70s and 80s when India was growing at 2-3%, and actually the population was also growing at 2-3% or 2%, so the per capita growth rate was not really there at all. So I think this is, and I think that was because of wrong economic policies. So since we already have a bad term, let's kind of flip the metaphor. And why do I think it will be around $12 trillion conservatively, say by end of 2030? So right now, say end of 2018, it was around $2.7 trillion, give or take. So if you want to go from 2.7 trillion to $12 trillion in 12 years, that's a compounding of 13% in dollar terms. 12.9, 13 something. So how do we have 13% compounding? Actually, in the last few years in the 80s and early 90s, we had around 5% in dollar terms. From 2003 to 2015, 16, we had around 11%. But there also, it was more during 2003 and 2008, and less so after that. So I'm here basically telling you it's not going to be 11% or less, it will be 13% or more. And why is that? So what is basically just basic math? You take your country's growth rate in rupee terms, like real growth rate right now is around 7%, 7.5%. You slap on and add inflation to it. So let's say now we have a target of 4%. So let's say we stick to 4%. So that's your growth rate in rupee nominal terms. And then to convert into dollar terms, the big question is what happens to rupee dollar? So in the last 15, 20 years, the rupee dollar actually has been, every year, the rupee has been on average depreciating between 3, 4, maybe 5%. So I'm saying, let's say, for a moment, we grow at 8%. Inflation is 4%. So for me to hit 13%, for rupee, instead of depreciating by 3%, actually has to appreciate by 1%. Is that clear to everybody? I'll repeat it. So if you want to hit 13% dollar growth, and let's say there is 8% rupee growth, 4% inflation is the RBI target. They seem quite serious about it no matter who is the governor. The rupee, instead of depreciating by 3% or whatever, 4% every year, needs to appreciate by 1% over the next 12 years. So that seems like a tall claim, and we'll go through that. So the GDP is around $2.8, $2.9 trillion. This graph is interesting starting from 1960, that shows at market exchange rates, the average Indian's income divided by the average American's income. America is just a proxy for the developed West, this is larger economy, what's known as the frontier tech economy. It was around 3% in 1960, and by the way, it's still 3% right now. So in the last 60 years, we've gone from 3% of American per capita income to 3% of American per capita income. So that is because there was severe damage from, say, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In fact, in the 90s, it almost bottomed out at 1%. So if, let's say, the average American income dollar was like $30,000 in the 90s, the average per capita income in India was $300. Sure, you can adjust it by PPP, and I will come to that. You can adjust by cost of living, you can multiply it by 4, whatever it is. But when you go and meet the prime minister or president of another country, they don't care about cost of living. They care about how much hard dollars you can bring, either to buy defense or to trade deal or aid. So, an ancient civilization was basically in the pits because of colonialism, socialism, license raj, whatever, like 1%. I find it laughable. So all the growth that has happened in the last 20 years has only gotten us back to 1960. I'm now saying if you want to go to $12 trillion, roughly you have to be at 8% of American growth. So even $12 trillion will be still 8% of the average American growth rate, average American per capita income. Why? Because if you add American growth and inflation, it will be about $100,000 per capita income in 2030. It's right now 60,000. So 8% of 100,000 is $8,000. You multiply by $1.5 billion, 1.5 billion people in 2030. Right now it's 1.3 billion. That's $12 trillion. So even that $12 trillion, which seems aggressive and ambitious to a lot of people, takes us to 8% of an average American. Okay. So I'll come to why the dollar is likely to depreciate against the rupee, but I'm just letting you know the ground facts here. So that's what we are basically aiming for and why I'm bullish on it. So first, I'll quickly cover demographics and technology, what I call exogenous factors. Whether there is an idiot in the Prime Minister's office or there's a very hardworking, competent guy, the number of, the idiot in the Prime Minister's office is not really a hypothetical situation. It could happen. So, the number of babies who are born, who are 5 years old will grow 6 years old next year. You can't really change that. And technology, India right now is more an average technology taker. We copy a lot of stuff. We do contribute now, frugal engineering and all of that, but mostly we are a technology taker. So let's first look at the exogenous factors and then more on what we have done in addition. So first, demographics. In India, see, let's say the working age population, the World Bank and all that, they define it 15 to 64. But I think that's nonsense because nobody really gets educated and starts working at 15 anymore. So let's take 25 to 64 as the age group. The key fact here is more than 250 million people will join the workforce in the next 25 years in India. As a matter of comparison, 100 million people will drop out of Chinese workforce in the next 25 years. So the difference of the potential workforces between India and China over the next 25 years will be 0.35 billion. So, a lot of growth is just coming from here. If there are more hands at the wheel, you can push faster. And this curve is known as a population pyramid. So on the left, the blue ones, you have boys or men. On the right, you have girls or women. And then you have the age from 0 to 80. So this is what can be, don't take it the wrong way, it's a beautiful curve. In what sense? Because for African economies, it will be very, very bottom heavy. Much more children for a lot of Middle Eastern and African economies. For European economies, East European economies, the bottom is almost not there. And without immigration, it won't be there. So this is all that heaviness around the 10 to 20 age group over the next 10, 20 years will be working age. They'll be all working, or at least potential working age. So this is the graph. India, the working age population potential goes from 640 million to more than 900. China goes from 800 something to 700 something. Okay, so that's people who can work. Now, how many people will work and what kind of good workers will they be? First of all, let's start with the graph on the right. So The reason I put working women in quotation marks is because almost all women in India work. It's just that the question of whether they work inside the house or outside the house. So, it can come across as slightly condescending when I say the number of working women will increase because anybody who's gone to villages and slums knows how hard women work, especially compared to the men there. So, for working age, between the age of 15 to 25 to 65, actually the female labor force participation peaked at 45% about a decade ago, and then fell to 30%. So all the 7% growth, 8% growth we've been having with a headwind, with half of the population working less and less. Why was that? Because some of them were busy in families, some of them were getting educated. There's a social conservative angle, when you go from, there's a U-curve of sorts. You go from an illiterate village working woman, the family has some money and they see it as a sign of status that quote unquote their women are not working. And then you have urban educated graduate females who work. So there's a U-curve. And we seem to have bottomed out at the U-curve. If you look at it, kind of bottomed out at 30%, right now it's around 33%. So not only is the number of potential working age people going up by 250 million, who will actually work is going to increase dramatically. And this number is like twice in China, for example. So the actual difference will be more than 350 million in terms of the change, because that is potential, this is actual. For men, it's been around 95% participation between 25 and 65. So that remains more or less stable. And while they won't be the world's best educated workers, unlike the previous generations, they'll almost be fully literate, 100%. So this is literacy rates. I'm showing by the bottom two graphs are for the age of 25 and above, and the top two are below the age of 25, for both men and women. Within 2 or 3 years, that's going to 97, 98%. So, now you give them a basic cheap smartphone, you give them 4G, 5G, and they're on their way. They're on the first ladder of a basic job, and then on-the-job training takes it from there. But if you're not even educated or literate, you don't even get on the first ladder of success. So I think that's a massive change. Okay, so demographics, we need to quickly move on. That was, I think we hear it all the time, but I just wanted to make sure you appreciate how big it is. Then technology. See, what is India's biggest macroeconomic problem? It's crude imports, right? So, we have like 4 million passenger vehicle cars being sold every year. In China, it's about 25 million, even though it's falling a bit off late. How do you, and we'll soon have hybrid and electric cars in 3-4 years. Okay, I think somebody who sells oil got angry at that. Basically, it's angry again. No, I know. So very soon, batteries, whether it's be for car batteries or for larger batteries, the cost has fallen by 5 times in the last 10 years, and it's continuing at the same pace. Now, what that means is there are a lot of solar and wind power already assets in India on the ground which are not being used. So they come up in the capacity, but so let's say coal is 70% of what actually delivers power in India. Let us say even if it's 50, 60% of the capacity. The reason is very simple. In the night, there is no solar power. And if you need an AC working in your home in the night, for your home you need a coal plant, then you might as well have it for the daytime as well. You can't delete the coal plant in the daytime, right? So, but the moment you can store energy at an affordable rate, you can store the daytime wind or solar energy, and that completely changes Indian economics. From the car to the bottom up. So that's basically one thing to appreciate, because it's a tipping point. It won't happen gradually. It won't happen for 2-3 years, and then it'll suddenly happen over 4-5 years. Then, this is something I'm sure a lot of people in Bangalore will appreciate even more. We've had waves of outsourcing. We started with a basic BPO, then we went to KPOs, now it's called captives or GICs. And Bangalore is the hub of it. All the multinationals have captives in Bangalore. I mean, the whole real estate is running on that, the whole city is running on that. But what if that's just the trailer? The services exports, right now you do a lot based on email, occasionally Skype, but the quality is not good enough to have that human level of trust. What if you have very good, absolutely low latency, brilliant 3D Skype for free? You know, Cisco has, Cisco has some these video conferencing. I'm sure some of you have seen that, but they're really expensive, top end. What if you have even better than that, but for as free as Skype? I think we are only 3 or 4 years away from that. As soon as you have low latency, high speed, 10 times faster 5G, you can have augmented reality. It's almost like I'm standing in New York, but you're seeing me here in Bangalore. Almost Star Trek type. So the moment that starts happening, somebody in Bangalore can teach in New York University for $10,000 instead of $50,000. So now blue-collar jobs don't get outsourced. White-collar jobs get outsourced as well. And not just on the BPO, KPO fringe, like mainstream white-collar jobs. So then that 3% and 8% difference, that economics becomes really attractive. I'm sure there'll be a lot of billionaire entrepreneurs coming out of Bangalore based on this in a matter of 4 or 5 years. So already India is consuming the most GB per person compared to even developed economies, thanks to geo, sure, thanks to low cost. But this is not a hypothetical, it's already happening. We are just in the early stages of it. So that was demographics and technology. Now these things are happening no matter who's sitting in Delhi. Now I come to the next part. Where have we done? This is all passive stuff that's happening to us. After decades or centuries of bad luck, we are coming through some good luck. Fine. Headwinds are becoming tailwinds, but this headwind to tailwind is in our hands, in our democracy. So what has happened there is what I've called grandiosely Modinomics, but I think Reasonomics is actually a better term for it, because it's rational policy making. And what is that? The 5 elements I mentioned was infra, financing lower inflation interest rates, some structural reforms, formalizing and financializing, and finally state capacity, which kind of summarizes the whole second half of the speech as well. So let's go to infra. India has been investing more or less the same as the Chinese now, especially on railways, communications, energy, but we were extremely behind on roads. And this government, just like the first NDA government, has significantly increased spending. Those are 2014 numbers. But now if you look at construction, the speed has gone up twice in already 4 years. 20, 25 kilometers per day from, say, 10 kilometers per day. So just to get a quick example, why are roads so important? See, India's population density is, say, 400 people per square kilometer. But that sounds like a lot compared to America or Australia. It's actually the same as Netherlands or Belgium, more or less. But 400 per square kilometer is actually, what is a square kilometer? If you do 100 meters into 100 meters, there are 100 such blocks, right? 100 meters are 10 here, 10 there. So per 100 meters into 100 meters, or what is known as a hectare, I think, you have only 4 people. So imagine a 100-meter race track and then a 100-meter race track, that big square. There is enough land even in India. The problem is the accessibility of land. So if you're in Bombay, which is an island, and you don't have any bridges to Navi Mumbai, now we are making a trans harbor, blah, blah, blah. And in Delhi and Bangalore, if you don't build metros till late, then even where the offices are, you can't stay very far away from it given the traffic, right? But what if you can? Then your rent as a percentage of your salary falls dramatically. Your EMI as a percentage of your salary falls dramatically, and your purchasing power goes up. So infrastructure is very important also for logistics. If you're going to manufacture in Bihar and UP, where there's some of the cheapest labor available in India, they don't have to come to Karnataka that much. If there are good roads, if you have waterways, you can just directly ship to Calcutta port, Haldia, and just go from there to USA, China, wherever. So hard infrastructure is what a lot of economists will not tell you, because a lot of them, like me, have been trained outside India, and we have this bias of missing infrastructure. Because in the UK and US, it has been done in the 50s. So they don't discuss there, so we also don't discuss it here. But that doesn't make it less important. Then, this is what I was mentioning. So inflation differential. Now this comes to how the rupee is likely to act in the next 10, 12 years. So this is for the last 30 years. The blue one is Indian inflation, the green one is American inflation, just again as a proxy for developed economies. So Indian inflation was always around double digits. During Vajpayee's time, it was almost 4%. This is a 3-year rolling average. During Vajpayee's time, it was 4%. Again, during UPA's time, it went up to double digits, and now it's 4%. But this time, it's likely to stick at 4%, no matter who comes to power, because now it's the official mandate of the RBI. Unless you change the mandate itself, which I think is unlikely, and the RBI has shown to be quite serious, no matter who's the governor, to actually be at 4%. And the American unofficial target, just like European, Japanese, Australian, New Zealand, is 2%. So your average inflation differential comes down from, say, 6 or 7% or 5% to 2% going forward. 4 minus 2. So now this is just, I don't want to get too technical, but let us say the rupee inflation is 4%, dollar inflation is 2%. And if the next year the rupee starts at 70 and stays at 70, then what we call it in economics is the rupee has appreciated in real terms by 2%. Because if it was not appreciating by real terms, it should have fallen by 2%, the inflation difference. So it should have gone from 70%, 70 rupees to 71 rupees and 40 paisa. 2% of 70 is 1 rupee 40 paisa. So the fact that it did not happen, that means the rupee is appreciated by 2%. Now what happens is when an economy starts growing and catching up with the richest economies, it sees real appreciation in its currency, especially around this phase of growth of per capita income in India. To put it in even simpler way, if you go by official World Bank data, if you go to any cost of living indices, say the average cost of living in India is 3.5 times less than America, say. So when India is slightly richer, say 8% of American incomes, the cost of living multiplier will reduce to say 2.5. If you become China, it goes to 1.5. If you become as rich as Europe, it goes to basically 1, which is why there is no significant difference between Europe and America. The Chinese are cheaper than America, cost of living, but more expensive than India. And the only place is probably cheaper than India, probably sub-Saharan Africa, Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So that real appreciation happens from say 3.5 to 2.5, that by itself adds 3% per year. Easily. 3% real appreciation per year. It could be 2, it could be 4. But what that means is, remember that 8% growth in rupee terms, 4% inflation took you to 12% in nominal rupee terms. Now, in previous years, that would go down to 9% because of depreciation. But in the coming years, that 12, instead of going to 9, will become 13. Is that now somewhat clearer? So because we are in that, and the funny thing is, the faster you grow, the rupee appreciation also goes faster. So it's like a virtuous cycle. If you grow at 10%, the rupee appreciation won't be real terms 3%, it will be 4%. So then it will be 10% plus 4% rupee inflation, plus another 2%, 16%. And that will take you to 16 or 17 trillion dollars by 2030. So which is why I mentioned $12 trillion is slightly on the conservative side for me. Because I think we'll see higher growth, partially because of demographics, technology, and now what comes next. So once inflation falls, and interest rates in India haven't really fallen that much. But once the market realizes that this low inflation is here to stay, then interest rates also fall. And there are, I think, some people from real estate here. I think so. Who's from real estate? Okay. So in real estate, there is something called capitalization rate, right? Cap rate. So basically, if you have 1,000 crores of rent, how much is the building worth? If the cap rate is 10%, the building is worth 10,000 crores. If the cap rate is 5%, the building is worth 20,000 crores. You just divide the rent by the cap rate. So as soon as interest rates fall, cap rates fall, your EMIs fall for cars, for student loans, for homes, for your factory loans. If you are an infrastructure company which owns a road with tolls, the value of the road goes up. Any person who has cash flows, his asset becomes more valuable. And anybody who's making an asset, it becomes cheaper for him. Right? So India is not like China. We are not using our state banks and to build a massive infrastructure. We are actually transitioning from what is the continental European and East Asian model, only in terms of finance, to an Anglo-American model. So we'll soon have REITs. And the biggest one is the Embassy Park one, Blackstone one. And then more will follow. We already have a couple of InvITs. It's difficult, it's just launching. So the idea is as soon as interest rates come down, all kinds of investment and consumption boom. So we are seeing 7% for the last 4-5 years when we were in this most difficult transition phase, when inflation had fallen, but interest rate had not fallen. So if we can see 7% then, we can imagine what we can see when it becomes normal. Okay, so quickly reforms. This, I'm sure you've heard. This is something you probably have heard many times. You know, faster, more sustainable, more cleaner, less crony capitalist, less crony socialist growth through GST, the bankruptcy code, through RERA, again, for anybody who's in the real estate sector. All of these caused short-term pain, but will cause long-term gain. You know, it's like going to gym and being on a diet and then hitting the dating market after a couple of years. Whereas, so that's Modinomics in a way. But what was Abenomics? Abenomics was sugar high of fiscal stimulus, sugar high of monetary stimulus. That's like you're depressed, you want a sugar high. So a lot of this infrastructure investment is also a long gestation period, right? Nobody in the villages instantly likes highways coming next to them that cattle can't cross the roads. Nobody in cities likes half the road blocked for a metro station when it's being constructed. You like the metro station only once it is done. But the 3-4 years of construction is a pain, right? So we are having cleaner growth rate. I mean, GST is mostly good. I have some disagreement on some federalism angle, but let's not go into details. The REITs are coming. So there are many ways of reinvesting and recycling capital, which are very, very advanced for our per capita income. Very good reforms have happened, contrary to some opinions. Then again, this is a very classic Bangalore thing. Digital payments have gone, I don't know how many 100 times up. I'm talking about not about the number of transactions, but the value through UPI. No wonder MasterCard and Visa are so pissed off right now. And no wonder the US is trying to put some pressure on us through small protectionism. We don't really need a US server to give money from A to B here. You know, they want to get 1% on everything, 0.5% on everything. These kind of innovations, UPI, the whole digital architecture, I've lived in Singapore, I've lived in UK, I've lived in US, I've lived in Hong Kong. Today, Indian digital architecture is better than all those 4 places. Seriously. I'm sure many of you have also traveled and have similar opinions. This is the final slide, but I'll take some time on this. So we have about 10 minutes left? Okay. This slide will take 10 minutes if I want. So a good summary of the second half of the speech is that Indian state is finally getting capacity, effective. What does that mean? You know, first of all, unlike the Chinese civilization, which has always been a civilizational state, you know, at least in their popular imagination. Even if the Mongols and the Manchus ruled it and they never had Xinjiang or Tibet, whatever, for Chinese people, unification under one state is the ideal, which is why they're so obsessed with Taiwan, amongst other reasons. But for the Indian civilization, except under the Mauryas or the Guptas or the British or the Mughals, that also partially, most of the time we were politically divided. We were more of a cultural civilization. So the state, and again, then also last few centuries, you know, one can argue it either ways. The Indian state was not in the hand of Indians in many ways. So this state is a new creature to the Indian imagination. And if you even go by Western philosophy, you know, liberalism is, say, John Locke. I don't know, some of you have read John Locke in your college times, or maybe you're all bunking lectures. And there's another philosopher called Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes came before John Locke in Western philosophy. What Thomas Locke says is, first you need to have a state. Like in this particular room, the state will be dominant. Nobody else will have the monopoly on violence. The state could be a dictatorship, it could be a democracy, whatever. The first thing is to have order through a state. You know, if you go by some like reductionist, lazy libertarian arguments, Somalia should be the richest part of the world. There is no state in Somalia. But it is actually the poorest part of the world. The state is not the enemy. Like a lot of free market, like we don't have to go from one extreme of having a terribly corrupt and inefficient state to saying, oh my God, the state is terrible. The state is extremely important in growing. But the question is, how do you use that state? It's like any power, right? You have a nuclear bomb, you can throw nuclear bombs, or you can generate electricity out of it. So what we did, so besides, the state is now saying, if I'm sending 1 rupee, it goes to the person through UPI, through Aadhaar, through JAM, through India Stack, which again, people in Bangalore have made, and across parties, by the way. But also trade policy. You know, one of the first things that Japan lost as soon as Commodore Perry reached Japan was control of its trade policy. One of the first things the British took away from Indians when they conquered India was trade policy. So free trade is extremely important, But the infant industry argument is still relevant. Today, the Chinese economy is, say, market is 5 times bigger than us. Their industrial sector is 2 times larger as a percentage of GDP. So their industrial sector is 10 times bigger than us. Even if you don't have any subsidies there, just on economies of scale, the marginal output of the average average Chinese factory will be much cheaper than the Indian. Now, of course, it's changing because of labor rates and pollution controls and so on and so forth. But that's partially because Narendra Modi has reversed 2 decades of non-stop tariff decreasing in the last 2 years and has increased tariffs very, very tactically. So India joined ITA, Information Technology Agreement under World Bank in '96. And we went from high tariffs to 0 tariffs for all our hardware imports in telecom, phones. And what was an 80% indigenous industry became, say, a 20% indigenous industry within a few years. Nobody wanted to put a factory here. They would go to China, they would go to Guangzhou, Shenzhen, they would import it and they'll sell it here. Now we are having these phased manufacturing plans. We'll put duties on what we are currently building. We'll not put duties on what we are importing for that building. So we'll go through every 6-month policy that whatever is the next stuff that we want to indigenize, we'll put a tariff on that. And on inputs for that, we will not have tariffs. So it's a very specific policy that can only happen with the credibility of an honest government, because this is a very easy system to game, to have crony capitalism in it. But this is what the Americans did under Alexander Hamilton, what the Germans did through the Zollverein Customs Union, which is basically the forefather of the EU right now. What Japan did, what South Korea did, and what China did. One of the reasons why Trump is having a trade war with China, one of the reasons. So we finally are seeing some growth in Make in India because we are agreeing to think heterodox as well. You know, America today speaks of free trade because it is the richest country. But as soon as Chinese manufacturing became efficient, the Americans went back on free trade. Now today the Chinese speak of one belt, one road. In the 19th century, when the UK were the most efficient, they spoke of removing corn laws. But in the 18th century, they put tariffs on textile imports from Bihar and Bengal. So I'm not saying to be fully mercantilist, but there is something to be done about a smart industrial trade policy that we are finally doing, which is already showing dividends in terms of smartphone manufacturing. And we did in the last cabinet decision, we did announce it for electric vehicles and batteries. So state capacity means that, you know, especially for large countries, if you're a Singapore or a Hong Kong, it makes sense to have full free trade. But when you have 1.3 billion customers, the opposite of monopoly is monopsony. What that means is you have collective bargaining power. So this is not license Raj. You're even allowing all foreigners, Samsung, to make any factory they want. This is not like George Fernandez throwing out Coca-Cola. This is full competition, but they're saying if the factory is in India, you get a 10% advantage over if the factory is in South Korea. So there is full free domestic market, and you're leveraging the large integrated single market to get technology transfer and manufacturing jobs to India. And what is the problem of an economy like in India? We have surplus labor. In America, 1% of the population produces all the food they eat. In India, it takes 30%. I mean, the 50-60% number is outdated. It's around 30%. But that still has a 30%, 30x productivity gap possible. And the reason is there's nothing for those people to do, partially because they were not skilled, they were not experienced, but partially India directly went to services. You know, again, in Bangalore, thanks to Bangalore. We kind of missed the manufacturing phase. So a lot of the problems after liberalization got kind of under the carpet because the services boom, which nobody expected, just like nobody today is expecting a 5G or AR boom right now, a lot of manufacturing weaknesses got hit. But now this government has decided that we'll fire on all cylinders. Not just services, not just agriculture, but also manufacturing. Jab automation hoga, we'll see, but right now we'll go for manufacturing as well. So state capacity in India, in any country, has been critical, if you are a student of economic history, for growth. It's a very superficial kind of narrative. Incentives are very important. Where needed, you should not have the government intervention. Like, for example, if you're a school teacher in a government and you can't get fired, obviously you're not going to work as hard as a private school teacher who can get fired. But that does not mean that any and every free market, especially in foreign interactions, is relevant. You can't import steel from China. You can't import all your electronics from China if you also have a border war with them. You know, they use that economic leverage against South Korea when they had an anti-missile defense. They said, you know, sorry, we will stop tourism to China. So anyway, I don't want to speak too much on that. That's on the next topic. So I'll just conclude by saying Indian growth story is going to be much bigger than what a lot of people are expecting or appreciating right now. Two of the three reasons are actually exogenous, but a third reason is also policy-driven and endogenous. And that actually is in our hands and not really in our stars. Thank you so much.